Marcus was a corrections officer for 11 years at a county jail in rural Georgia. He started when he was 23 years old, fresh out of the military, looking for stable work close to home. He was physically fit, mentally tough, not easily rattled. He'd done a tour overseas, seen things that would break most people. He thought a county jail in a small Georgia town would be manageable, routine even. He said the first 2 years were exactly that, routine. Drunk drivers, domestic cases, guys waiting on trial dates. The jail held about 200 inmates at capacity. Single-story, old building, built in the late 70s. Cinder block walls painted institutional gray. Fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly. The kind of place that felt like it had absorbed decades of misery into its walls and never let any of it out. D Block was the segregation unit, solitary confinement. 8 cells in a single row, each one a solid steel door with a narrow slot for trays. Inmates in seg had limited movement, limited contact. Most of them were there for violations, fighting, threatening staff, contraband. Some were there for their own protection. A few were there because they were genuinely dangerous and the general population couldn't safely house them. Cell 8 was at the very end of D Block, dead end of the hallway. It had been empty for the entire time Marcus had worked there, going on 2 years by this point. He'd asked about it early on and was told it was taken out of rotation for maintenance reasons. Something with the plumbing behind the wall. The drain in the floor backed up. There were issues with moisture. Standard enough explanation. He didn't think about it much. Then, one Tuesday night shift in February, he was doing his rounds on D Block alone. Standard check. Walk the row, look through each door slot, log it, move on. It was around 2 a.m. The block was quiet. Most of the occupied cells had their lights off, inmates asleep. He got to cell 8. The light inside was on. Not the overhead fluorescent. That was controlled from the officer station at the front of the block, and he hadn't switched it on. The light inside cell 8 was a different quality. Warmer, lower, like something was glowing rather than lit. He stood in front of the door for a second. The slot was closed. He reached down and slid it open. The cell was empty. No mattress, no fixture, no inmate. Just bare concrete floor, bare cinder block walls, that metal drain in the center of the floor. The light was gone the instant the slot opened, like it had been waiting on the other side of the door, and the opening of the slot extinguished it. He stood there looking into that dark, empty cell for a long moment. Then he closed the slot, logged the check, and finished his rounds. He told himself it was a reflection, light bouncing off something, his eyes playing tricks at 2 a.m. after a long shift. 3 weeks later, he was doing the same rounds, same shift, same time. Same thing. The warm glow visible through the crack at the bottom of the door. Gone the second he opened the slot. The third time it happened, he went back to the officer station and pulled the logbook for D Block going back 5 years. He was looking for anything unusual, any documentation about Cell 8 beyond the maintenance note. He found an entry from about 4 years prior. Brief, clinical, the way all official entries are written. An inmate had been placed in Cell 8 on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, he had been found unresponsive on the floor of the cell during the morning check. Cause of death was listed as cardiac event. The inmate was 31 years old.
Healthy 31-year-old men don't usually have cardiac events in their sleep. Marcus looked at the name. He looked at the date. He thought about the fact that nobody had been placed in that cell since. not for plumbing reasons, not for maintenance. He transferred to a different block and put in a request to never be assigned to D block overnight again. His supervisor asked why. Marcus told him about the light. His supervisor, a man who had worked that jail for over 20 years, didn't ask any follow-up questions, didn't tell Marcus he was imagining things, didn't write him up for it. He just said, "Yeah, don't go back down there at night." That was it. No explanation, no history offered. Just those 7 words from a man who'd been in that building for 2 decades and clearly already knew exactly what Marcus was talking about. Marcus quit corrections work entirely 2 years after that. He told me he doesn't miss the job. He doesn't miss the building. He doesn't miss the buzz of those fluorescent lights. But there are nights, he said, when he wakes up in the dark and his first instinct is to look at the bottom of the door for that glow.
This comes from a woman named Priya. She's in her early 40s now, lives in the Pacific Northwest. At the time this happened, she was working as a licensed mental health counselor, contracted to a large county jail in the Pacific Northwest, one of the bigger facilities in the region, holding close to 800 inmates. She worked the intake unit, which processed new arrivals around the clock. Her shift was overnight, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. She'd been doing the job for about 3 years when this happened. She was used to the overnight hours, used to the population that came through intake, people in crisis, people coming down off substances, people who were frightened or volatile or completely checked out. She'd heard everything. She was professionally trained to stay calm and regulated in situations that would destabilize most people. That training is the reason she stayed in that building as long as she did after what she experienced. On a Thursday night in November, the intake unit was unusually slow. By 3 a.m., only 4 new arrivals had come through, all processed and moved. The holding area, a large room with fixed benches bolted to the walls and a heavy door at each end, was empty. Priya was doing documentation at the small desk in the intake corridor outside the holding room. The door to the holding room had a narrow vertical window, wire-reinforced glass, about 4 inches wide and 18 inches tall, standard jail construction. She glanced up at the window. There was a man standing inside the holding room. She stood up immediately and went to the door. There should not have been anyone in there. She'd processed the last arrival over an hour ago. The room had been cleared and locked. She looked through the window. The man was standing near the far wall, facing away from her. She could see he was wearing the standard-issue jail clothing: gray shirt, gray pants, average build, dark hair, standing completely still. She called the officer station on her radio and said she had an unaccounted person in the intake holding room, asked for a check on who had access and whether anyone had been moved back in without her knowledge. The officer on the other end told her to hold and checked the logs. He came back and told her the room had not been accessed since she'd cleared it. Both entry doors were showing locked and secured on the panel. Priya looked back through the window. The man was still there, still facing away. She described what happened next very carefully to me. She said she knocked on the glass, hard, 3 times. A knock loud enough that anyone in the room would clearly hear it. The man turned around. She said his face was wrong, not in any way she could specifically describe. She's a mental health professional. She's trained in observation, and she tried very hard to articulate it. She said it wasn't disfigured, wasn't monstrous, just wrong. Like looking at a face that wasn't quite finished. Features that were slightly too far from where they should have been. She stepped back from the window.
She radioed for an officer to come to intake immediately. While she waited, she watched through the window. The man stood there, looking at the door, looking at her. The officer arrived within 2 minutes. He looked through the window. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I don't see anyone." Priya looked back through the window. The room was empty. 2 officers did a full walkthrough of the intake area, both holding rooms, all connecting corridors. No one there. Priya sat down and wrote up an incident report. The officer who'd responded, a veteran of the facility, 12 years in, sat with her while she wrote it. He didn't tell her she'd imagined it. He didn't make the kind of joke you'd expect someone to make. She asked him if anything had ever happened in that room. He was quiet for a while. Then he told her that about 8 years ago, a man had died in the intake holding room during processing, medical event during booking. By the time staff realized what was happening, it was too late. Priya asked if the man had been wearing jail-issue clothing when he died. The officer said yes. He'd been transferred from another facility, already processed, gray shirt, gray pants. She asked what the man had looked like. The officer pulled out his phone after a moment. She thought he was going to look something up, some report. Instead, he just set it face down on the desk and said, "You should think about whether you really want to know that." She didn't ask again. She finished out her contract at that facility, 4 more months. She never saw the man in the holding room again. But every single night when she walked past that wire glass window, she felt the same thing. The feeling that if she looked through it at the wrong moment, she would see him again, standing there, facing away, waiting to turn around. Pay close attention to this one, because this isn't a story about something that was seen or heard and then explained away or filed under uncertainty. This is a story that has a specific, documented detail at the center of it that nobody, not the people involved, not the facility administrators, nobody has ever been able to account for. This comes from a man named Robert. He's 52, spent 19 years working in a state correctional facility in the Midwest. Not a county jail, a state prison, medium security, holding around 1,200 inmates. He worked his way up from floor officer to shift supervisor over those 19 years. He knew that building completely. Every corridor, every cell block, every utility room, every blind spot in the camera coverage. He knew it the way you know a place you've spent more waking hours in than your own home. The old wing of the facility, they called it the East Block, had been built in the 1940s. The newer sections of the prison had been added over the decades, but East Block was original construction. High ceilings, narrow cells, the kind of heavy iron infrastructure that reminded you this building had been doing the same thing for 80 years. It housed general population inmates, medium risk, nothing unusual about the assignment. Cell 14 in East Block had been a standard cell for decades, housed thousands of inmates over the years, nothing in its history that stood out. In the late fall of the year Robert's story takes place, an inmate named Calvin was assigned to Cell 14. Calvin was in his mid-30s, serving time on a non-violent offense, 18 months total. Quiet, kept to himself, no disciplinary history. The kind of inmate who does his time without creating problems. About 3 weeks into Calvin's time in Cell 14, he requested a cell reassignment. Robert handled the request personally because Calvin was so unusually insistent about it. Inmates requested reassignments for all kinds of reasons: conflict with cellmates, medical accommodations, programming schedules. Calvin was in a single occupancy cell. There was no cellmate issue. Robert sat down with him to understand what was going on. Calvin told him he couldn't sleep in that cell. Robert asked why. Calvin said someone kept saying his name at night. Robert asked him to explain. Calvin said it started about a week after he moved in. He'd be lying on his bunk at night, lights out, block quiet, and he'd hear his name. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken. Clearly at a normal conversational volume from inside the cell. His full name, first and last. Not just Calvin, his full name.
Robert took it seriously, but explained to Calvin that sounds traveled strangely in old concrete construction, that voices from adjacent cells or the corridor could distort and seem close. Calvin shook his head. He said he knew the difference. He'd been in facilities before. He knew what sound bleed sounded like. This was inside the cell, right there. Robert couldn't approve a reassignment based on that. He told Calvin to document it, write down every time it happened, what time, what exactly he heard. Calvin said okay. Over the next 10 days, Calvin submitted 4 written accounts. Each one said the same thing, between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. His full name spoken once, clearly, from inside the cell. No pattern to which night it happened. No other sounds accompanying it. On the 11th day, Calvin stopped submitting reports. Robert checked with the floor officer. Calvin was still in cell 14, still quiet, no issues. Robert made a point of checking in with him personally during his next shift. Calvin seemed different, less agitated. Robert asked if the voice had stopped. Calvin looked at him for a moment and said, "I looked behind the bunk." Robert asked what he meant. Calvin told him there was a gap between the back of the metal bunk frame and the cell wall, maybe 3 inches. He'd moved the bunk out from the wall to look in there because the voice always seemed to come from that direction. He'd found something scratched into the wall behind the bunk. Robert went to the cell that afternoon during movement period when Calvin was at programming. He moved the bunk himself and looked at the wall. There was writing scratched into the concrete. Old, the scratches had the gray, dusty look of something that had been there a long time. The edges worn slightly smooth. Done with something hard, a nail or a piece of metal. It was a list of names. 8 names, scratched one above the other. Uneven lettering, the kind of writing someone does slowly and carefully when they don't have much to work with. 7 of the names meant nothing to Robert. Old inmate names, he assumed. Decades old based on the wear on the scratches. The 8th name, the last name on the list, scratched below the others, was Calvin's. His full name, first and last, exactly as Calvin had heard it spoken in the dark. Robert stood in that cell for a long time. He had the name documented, photographed, reported to the facility administrator. They pulled records going back to the 1940s on cell 14. They cross-referenced the other 7 names on the wall. 6 of the 7 matched inmates who had been housed in cell 14 at various points over the decades. The 7th they couldn't place in the records, but the records from the early years were incomplete. All 6 confirmed inmates had something in common. Each of them had died before completing their sentence. Different years, different circumstances. Medical events, 1 suicide, 1 death ruled accidental. Over the span of 60 years. Calvin's name was the only current name on the list. Robert approved the reassignment that afternoon. He put Calvin in a cell on the newer West Block the same day without going through the standard waiting period. He didn't explain the urgency to his supervisor. He just moved him. Calvin was released 14 months later, completed his sentence without incident. Robert requested that cell 14 be taken out of rotation. His request was denied. Not enough cells to remove one from inventory without documented structural or safety issues.
He documented everything he could, submitted it up the chain. Cell 14 is still in use. Robert retired from the facility 2 years after this happened. 19 years in that building, and he said there were only a handful of things that truly got to him. Things that broke through the professional distance you build up in that job. This was at the top of that list. Not because of the voice, he told me. Not even because of the names on the wall, but because of the question he's never been able to answer. Whoever scratched Calvin's name into that wall behind the bunk, they did it before Calvin ever set foot in that cell, before any assignment was made, before any of the events Calvin reported. Somebody, or something, knew he was coming, and they put his name on the list, and they waited.
These walls hold more than inmates. Some places absorb what happens inside them. Jails, prisons, buildings built around confinement and suffering and years of human beings at their lowest. If any place was going to hold on to something it shouldn't, it would be places like these. 3 officers, 3 facilities, 3 things they never put fully behind them. Lock your doors tonight. I'll see you in the next one.